don't forget, this Tuesday there will not be a Shiur. The next Shiur will be next Sunday. I can't come this Tuesday. Okay, I really want to move on in the sugya, but I just want to do a little bit of chazara on Kosev and Roshem that I was asked about at the end of in the middle of the last Shiur. I hadn't actually planned to speak about Roshem yet, and I hadn't noticed that it came up in the Mishnah in Kuf Gimel, which I had told everyone to look at. I told people to look at the Mishnah in Kuf Gimel for another reason, but Agav, it mentioned Roshem, so I hadn't sort of planned that part of the Shiur, and I'm conscious that maybe what I said wasn't so clear, so I just want to explain the matter again. The melachot of Kosev is that of creating symbols that carry content. That's the point of the melachot of Kosev. It's not merely about attaching ink to a background. You can attach ink to a background in order to decorate the cloth or the fabric to which the ink is attached, and that would be the melachot of tseveya. The point of Kosev is that the significance of the ink is not in its enhancement of the background, but in the information that it carries. That's the melacha of Kosev. In fact, it's possible, according to many Rishonim, that you can do the melacha of Kosev with no background at all. For example, a sculpture, or twisting a wire into a letter, a shape, or the like. In other words, it's not integral to Kosev. It may not at least be integral to the melachot of Kosev. You're attaching ink to fabric or to parchment or to paper at all. The point is that you are creating a symbol which carries information. That is the melacha of the melacha of Kosev. Now, what makes a symbol carry information? So there's at least three sorts of ways that a symbol can carry information. One way is because this is a recognized and agreed upon symbol, and that's at least what we call letters. From a halachic point of view, a number is also a letter. The number 3 is also a letter of sorts because it carries information. It's agreed upon complex shape that carries information. There can be another sort of symbol that carries information because integrally it carries information. So it's a picture, for example. So a picture is a symbol that carries information, and therefore that contains information. And again, therefore, this would be the melacha of Kosev. About that, I mentioned that there is considerable halachic discussion, and I don't know exactly the parameters of this, as to how, to what degree you need human consensus and convention to establish something as an ois, as a letter that carries information. So clearly it's enough if it's a language. What happens when a language is going extinct and there are very few carriers of the language anymore? At what point does it cease to be a language? What happens if it's an ancient language that's not used anymore, but only academics and researchers know this ancient script? Does that count as an ois in halacha? And then there's even discussion, maybe it only counts as an ois if in that area there's people that speak it. So if I write an ois which no one else will understand, anywhere in my region at all, does that count as an ois or not? So there's debate around at what point do we imbue what's ultimately a random squiggle with the status of information carrying when it's really just us humans and the convention that we have created that imbues it with that status. There is a somewhat analogous machlokas, and I'm not at all even for a moment suggesting that we can learn halachas from one to the other. I'm simply using it as a mashal. There's a halacha that we can say many tefillas b'chol lashon. For example, even Kriyas Shema, it's not a tefillah, but the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema, we can say b'chol lashon. Oh, it's telling me my battery is low again. There's that you can say b'chol lashon. Even Kriyas Shema can be said Kriyas Shema can be said b'chol lashon. And the poskim discuss, and this is summarized in a lengthy biur halacha. What it means b'chol lashon, and the conclusion of the biur halacha is it's only in a region where people speak that language. So you can say Lashon HaKodesh in any area, but why? Because as the Mishnah explains, Lashon HaKodesh is a sort of intrinsic Lashon, but French you can only say in an area where people speak, some people are unmuted. I'm just going to mute everyone unless you want to ask a question, just because we're getting a lot of interference, and I'll come back to you if you want to unmute yourselves. So you can only say B'yotza Kriyas Shema in French in France, says the Mishnah Berurah. You can't B'yotza in Argentina where no one speaks French. Again, it's unclear what the parameters are. Here we live in London, which I think is the second largest French-speaking city in the world, because there's so many French people that have moved to London. So would that count? It's very difficult halacha l'maaseh to paskin exactly what the parameters of this are. But this is a sugya, and there's a somewhat analogous sugya in the melachot of Kosev. as to what degree the symbol has to fundamentally carry content. That is with respect to the Av Melacha of Kosev. Then, as I mentioned the last year, there's a Mishnah in Kuf Gimel, which I hadn't planned to speak about, but I did put that Mishnah on the sources, so I should have been prepared for that, in which the Mishnah says that even Simonios is the Melacha, and even Roshem is Melacha. So Simonios is its own topic. Simonios sounds like symbols which aren't letters. The Rishonim give the example of upside down nuns in Baloscha. Maybe it'd be things like brackets and an asterisk nowadays, a little star symbol and the like. And that the Mishnah lists as Simonios. And again, I'm not. Yes, it could mean Yeah.
Would vowels fall under writing then rather than simoniot?
Sorry, Gary?
Would vowels, like a segal, that fall under writing rather than under...
That's very, I don't know. I should know, but I don't know. Gary's asking about vowels, or even Tami Hamikra, the trop. It's a good question. I'll make a note of that and look at that. Well, trop.
I'm not sure they even had vowels in the days of the Mishnah and the Gemara.
No, the current vowel system that we use, it's a machlokas, but it may have been formed only in the era of the Gaonim. Nonetheless, it's a good question. Punctuation marks is also another example. Modern day punctuation marks, again, they didn't have that. Questions?
Which Lafarge really
You can look there on Kuf Gimel, you can look at the Rashba, for example. The Rashba brings from, I didn't print this in the sheets because we're not learning the whole Malach of Kosev, we're learning outside of Kosev. If you want the Maram Komis, there's a Rambam, by the way, obviously, the Rambam Paskins this Mishnah. Have a look at the Rambam, and have a look at the Rashba, who brings different dayas around this, and he brings up Hygon and other things. I'm not planning to go into all of this, it's beyond I wasn't planning to go into Roshim at all, but since I was asked about it, so, I mean, to be fair, the Mishnah I told people to look at does bring it, so I should have been prepared for questions around this. So that's one thing in the Mishnah, Simonios or Samamonios, depending on the Gersa. And the second thing the Mishnah mentions is the issue of Roshem. Now, Roshem, according to the Tanakhama, and this is how the Rambam paskins, again, I didn't put the Rambam on the source sheets because I don't want to speak about it in Perek Yud Aleph Halacha Yud Zayin, says that Roshem is a tolda. Why is Roshem a tolda? Because the mark made in Roshem doesn't intrinsically carry information because of the nature of the mark. It only carries information because of the use of the mark. So if I underline something, it's simply a line. What makes the underlining carry information? Because I understand that I've underlined it in order to draw emphasis to this point. If I put a line through writing, then I'm indicating, it may not be mochek because I'm not obliterating the writing, but I'm indicating that this is a mistake. If I'm a copy editor and I put a line through something, I'm indicating that this should be removed. So Roshem is where something carries information. It's a third sort of Kosev, if you like. It carries information not because the symbol intrinsically bears information because of convention or consensus about the quality of information. It's just a line. Lines don't carry information, but because of the context of how it's put. Roshem can go very far. There are posting that discuss if I bend the corner of a book in order to indicate this is where I'm up to in my reading, or to indicate that this is a very interesting page, and when I relook at the book, I should relook at this page. Maybe that's a type of Roshem. A bent fold doesn't carry information. It's clear there in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Even if you just mark with your fingernail and sort of etch onto something, that could be Kosev because it's communicating information. But this is a tolda. It's a very different sort of Kosev because it's not that the symbol in and of in itself carries information, other than the context of the symbol carries information. So this was the second point that I made in the share.
Sorry, can I ask on that? Sorry, can I just ask on? I'm struggling to see the difference between Roshem and Simonio. I know you're saying that one of them does carry intrinsic information, whereas the other one doesn't. But in the case of a bracket or an arrow or asterisk, whatever it is, surely that only carries some sort of information in the context that it's written.
So it's not clear. So that's why I mentioned Simonius as somewhere in between in that case. Okay. Simonius they are to some degree perhaps agreed upon conventional symbols. So an arrow is a consensus-driven symbol. Can you hear me, Josh? Yeah, okay. So an arrow is a symbol that carries content. An asterisk is a symbol that carries content. A bracket, the punctuation, Gary's question, a trop or a vowel, these are symbols that carry content, nonetheless, the nature of their content is different to that of an oath. A letter or a number carries inherent content. A simonios carries a content that is affected by context, clearly. A roshim is even less than that. A roshim carries no content at all, other than when found in the context as an indicator for something else completely separate. So these are three examples of Kosev, and each one needs to be looked in its own halachic criteria. Again, I don't mean this is beyond the scope of. None of this is really found in our sugya. We learn in Kosev from the context of our sugya. Just for better or for worse, since I was assigned to that Mishnah, we've now seen the Mishnah that talks about the parameters of Kosev. So I'm mentioning something about it, but these are questions around the melacha of Kosev.
I'm sorry to repeat the question from Tuesday, but how did you understand Rabbi Yossi's statement that the Shtei Otiyot only chayav ele mishum roshem?
Rabbi Yossi understands not like this, but we're going like the Tanakhama, like how the Rambam paskins, that Kosev is Kosev and Roshem is Roshem, because it's a different thing.
So Rabbi Yossi is considering that Roshem is the Av. Is that?
It's so would appear, or it looks to me, and this was the final point I made in Shiur, I don't really know the answer to this. Everyone assumes that in the Mishkan, the melacha was done through Osius. That's what it appears to be the case. I don't know why this assumption is there, because if the purpose of the melacha in the Mishkan was to link up different posts, they could have used simonius or they could have used roshem to do the melacha. But the Meister, everyone assumes that they were doing Osius, and therefore the Chachamim say that Av Malach is Kosev when you're doing letters or numbers for that matter. And Rabbi Yossi says no, the significance of the Malacha is the Roshem Shabbat, the mark within it. Even though it sounds like from his language, even he agrees that what was done was Kosev. He just says that's not the significance of the Malacha. The significance of the Malacha was Roshem. Why are we assuming in the Mishkan it was done with letters? Maybe just for sound reasons of common sense, which is you can do a mark if you just have two posts that you want to connect together. If you have a multitude of them, it makes sense to begin using letters or numbers, because how many simonim can you come up with that will, or how many marks can you use that will link the note to note? Do one line on one post and one line on another post, and the next post 2 lines and 2 lines and 3 lines and 3 lines. You run out of of non-symbol markings, and if it makes sense to switch to symbols, and it makes sense to actually switch to how many symbols can you come up with? 1 asterisk, a triangle, a square. It makes sense to switch to letters or numbers, which are already made symbols, as a method of marking. So maybe it's just for reasons of common sense, but Chazal assumes that the way the melacha was done in the Mishkan was using Osius, and therefore the classic melacha is Kosev. What's with Roshem? The Tanakhama says it's a Tolda, and Rabbi Yossi seems to say no, the Chashivas of Kosev isn't in the letters, but in the Roshem Shabbat. But the Halacha, at least we paskin, that Roshem and Kosev are both Osa, but the Av Melacha is where it carries intrinsic content, and the Tolda is where it doesn't. And how far, and which letters, and whether the language is still spoken, and how widely it's spoken, and so on, is all interesting, an interesting machlokas, but not well beyond the scope of our study. So that's, I hope that's tidied up some of the confusion that's inadvertently left at the end of the last year. Unless there are more questions about this, I'd like to go on to the Shiur Run and go back to our study. Okay, so the Shiur Run, and by the way, I only printed the Shiur Run as as an example of the Rishonim, because many of the Rishonim speak about this either here or in Daf Kuf Gimel. He is Medayik. Again, it's very interesting. It's not a diuk that, to me, as the external reader, I would have thought was completely obvious. But he is Medayik, as are many others of the Rishonim and Nachronim. There's a language of Ois Achas Gedola. And they say, why does it have to be Ois Achas Gedola? Why can't it be even Ois Achas Benoni, like a regular Ois? Because it's not a Kosev Ois, somebody writes an Ois, the Yesh Ben Koma, and in its space there's enough room to write several Oisius. That would be enough, 2 Oisius, that would be enough to be chayav in the Melacha. Because if you write a typical Ois, there's always a smaller Ois that you can write. And the truth is, even if you write a small Ois, there's an even smaller Ois you could write till you get to a very tiny Ois, at which point maybe it can't come beyond the ability of humans to write a yet smaller Ois. So they're all Medayik, and they consider this a strong diuk, But why does the Mishnah say ois achad gedola? Surely it could have just said, if you write any ois which has in its space, to write two oises, because if you write a normal ois in normal writing, you could have written a smaller ois in its place. So this is the question that exercises the run. And because of this, the run says multiple layers of chidushim. And the first thing he says is that, well, let's look at the run inside, because it's a fairly difficult run to read. So if people have the run in front of them, with respect to Kosev, this is only one ois because it only contains one ois worth of information. With respect to Mochek, which is something to do with laying the groundwork for erasing oisius, it's enough to be, since it has space for two oisius, it's Mochek shtei oisius. But it's his an important, yeah. Okay, so the next topic we will discuss after we finish the run is what is the essence of the melacha of Mochek. Is the essence of the melacha of Mochek removing information, but it needs to be done for a positive and productive reason? Or is the essence of the melacha of Mochek preparation for Kosev? Adam here is highlighting that one could be medayik in the run, something to do with this debate, because when the run says that if you raise a large letter, it's like Mochek shtei oisius, he seems to say that the chashivas is because it's like Mochek two oisius. I'm not going to go into this now, but I don't think this is a good deal, and I'll tell you why. If the run means that it's like Mochek two oisius because of the chashivas of the letters that you are ridding yourself of, and he understood that the significance of the melacha of Mochek is removing information, then what he says is incomprehensible and factually not correct. The only information I'm removing is one ois, not two oisius worth of information. So therefore I'm forced to say that when he says it's like Mochek two oisius, he means it's in a less conceptual sense, and he simply means it's the same as being Mochek two oisius because it prepares the ground to write two other oisius in its place, in which case we don't have a diuk in the run with respect to this discussion. But again, we'll get to that question of what is the melacha of Mochek. But for now, I didn't pause over this language because I didn't see the language as significant. Then he carries on. He says it can't be that there's enough space to write two large letters in the place of this large letter that are the same size as this large letter, because that's impossible by definition. If you erase one large letter, you can't fit two equivalently large letters in its place. Nonetheless, but has to be somewhat analogous to the letter that you deleted. Shiur that they should at least be normal sized letters. Now he adds in another chiddush. It also has to be from the same writing which you erased. If it's written in Ksav Ashuris, which is what we call Sefer Torah script, then it has to be Ashuris. Why? If not, you can't be chayiv. He said that it's in a different font, in a different script. You can always fit in. You don't need Gedola again. There's never such a thing as being Mochek and Osi Ashuris, which can't fit in Osius in another font, which is smaller. So I don't know how to pronounce these words, but Kosev UMochek is a term used in the poskim. It's not entirely clear what it is. It features in Shulchan Aruch, in the Beit Yosef, and in the poskim. As another Kosev that was floating around. The context of where this is discussed is in Hilchas Gittin. The halacha is when you write a get, it has to be written very precisely, and the get has to contain within it the information, because the pasuk says the get has to be a sefer krisos. It has to be a sefer that is a cutting a krisos. It's a cutting off paper, cutting off text. It has to have embedded and imbued in the document everything that needs to be said. So the post can discuss what happens if you write it in other non-Kosev Ashuris fonts, like Rashi fonts or scripts and so on. And one of the forms they refer to, they talk about Kosev provincial Kosev, which seems to be what we call Kosev Rashi. Kosev Rashi, by the way, was not Rashi, didn't write in Kosev Rashi, as is well known. It was a Kosev that came from Spain or the Provence region or Italy. And the other Ksav, one of the other Ksav they talk about is Kosev UMochek. It seems like Kosev UMochek is what we call Hebrew printed, something akin to printed letters nowadays. So our printed letters nowadays are not script, they are block. On the other hand, they're simplified from Kosev UMochek. They get rid of Ksorim and they go with the tugging, the little crowns. They simplify a pay and a ches. A ches is either a double vav with a little hut roof or a zayin and a vav with a little roof. They simplify it. That's what Kosev UMochek sounds like. But whatever it is exactly, it's an alternative font of Lashon HaKodesh floating around in Spain around the time that the anonymous author of the Shiur was writing his work, and mentioned by the postscript all the way through to the 1600s. And the point the Ran is making over here, or the Shiur is making over here, is that it has to be from the same font. Otherwise, again, you wouldn't need Osachas Gedola. Even an Os Beinonis could fit in two letters of the same font as two letters in a different font, and it would fit in Gedolas. The point is, it's smaller. It's a simpler font. Yeah, it has all the 12s and extra details that are in Kosev UMochek are cut out, and much like our printed fonts. The Imkein my Gedola. What would the Gedola mean? Again, the same diuk. And obviously, it's exercised by the use of the language Gedola in the Gemara. If it could have said any Os, because you can put the small Os in. The only reason it says Gedola is to exclude when that there's enough space there to write two similar letters. And then he adds in a third detail, there has to also be has to be the same letter that you deleted. So the runner said three conditions. The first point is it has to be roughly analogous to the same sort of league of size. It can't mean exactly the same size, or the Gemara doesn't make sense, but at least it has to be Benoni. The second point is it has to be in the same font, and the third point is it has to be the same letter. If you raise an olive, then it has to be that you're a mochik, that you're planning, that has enough space to write another two alfin. Etc. Because if not, again, it's the same proof. Again, the same proof, because if he proves three things from the fact that it says Gedola, why does it say Gedola? Why can't it just say if you write any Os? Surely, with any Os, you can fit in a different font of the same letter. You can fit in a very tiny letter, or you can fit another letter in. So if it's a base, you can put two Vowels in or two Yudin in. These, from the Gedola, therefore, he proves all three rules. It has to be the same letter, it has to be the same font, and it has to be roughly the same order of magnitude of size. And he finishes off. He said you can't say it just says Gedola, because it wants to tell you it means bigger in contrast to Vav and Yud. Yud zehu dachuk ma'od. This is very dachuk. So don't think Gedola means to exclude a Vav or a Yud, because that's very dachuk. So there's two. I must admit, I don't really hear that diuk. I don't understand the diuk, but this is what the Ram tells us, that it can't mean Gedola meaning an aleph or a base as opposed to a Vav or a Yud. That wouldn't be called Gedola, he says. That's not what you call a base. No one refers, if I write an aleph and a base, you don't say, you've written large letters, having in mind to remove a Vav and Yud. So he thinks this is an unreasonable reading of the Gemara. Now, I don't really understand the numbers of the Ram, I have to confess. Why? If the melachot of Mochek is if the melachot of Mochek is removing information, you don't have two letters worth of information. You only have one letter worth of information. If the melachot of Mochek is preparing for Ksav, then what's wrong with preparing your chayyuv on Shabbos? No one's suggesting you only chayyuv on Shabbos for writing Oisius of a Sefer Torah, Ksav Ashuris. Everyone agrees you're chayyuv for writing English or Mishak or Rashi script or any of the other fonts that are available for writing Lashon HaKodesh. So why should Mochek not be for writing something else? What's the svara of this chiluk of the Ran? Unless the Ran means alomdus, that it's only Mochek when inherently, fundamentally, in my action, I'm preparing the grounds for writing a letter. Now, if I erase Kosev Ashuris, I'm fundamentally preparing the space for writing Kosev Ashuris. If I just erase a tiny spot of ink, even though technically there's enough space there to write two little yudin in script, which yud has no shape, it's just a little line, there's nothing that makes my act an act that's preparatory for that inherently. To be a melachot on Shabbos, there has to be a process melachot, a creative melachot that's achieving something, and therefore it has to be embedded in the action I'm doing, that this is an act of mechika, an act of preparation to write other letters. And therefore, says the one, if the letters I'm removing are analogous to the letters that I'm planning to put in place, then you can argue this is laying the groundwork for writing new letters. If the letters that I'm removing are completely different to the letters I'm putting in place, then they're not analogous to us. That. Now, again, I hear the concept, the point, I hear what the point the run is forcing us to think about over here, which is a really good question, which is what makes the mechika inherently a preparatory act for writing something else. Even if I raise a very tiny blob, it is technically preparing the paper. Fundamentally, the paper is now cleared of this blob, and I could write 2 yud in there. What makes my act carry within it the creativity of preparing space for another 2 letters? But we could have come up with different answers to this question. Because I said maybe it depends on intent. After all, we could say Masechet Shabbat lichtov. So if I'm blotting out this blob with intention to write a shuris, then it has to be large enough for 2 aces of a shuris. If I'm running out this blob with intention to write 2 script yods, then it's enough to write 2 script yods. So we could have heard that it's measured by subjective rather than objective standards, and it depends on my intention. Number one. Number two, even if we go with a run that's measured by objective standards, not subjective standards, I don't really understand the svara of the run, that because I raised an aleph, it's objectively now prepared for the writing of 2 alfin. And if I raise a base, it's objectively prepared for 2 bases. And even the font, if I raise an ashuris, therefore it's objectively preparing for writing other ashuris. Maybe I raise an ashuris in order to write script. Like, it has to be identical. Unless the run means it's because there's other writing on the page, and that has to be similar to other writing. It doesn't say that, and there's no evidence for that. Because Mishnah says if you erase 2 oases, during this phase, there are only 2 letters on the page. You're chayv. So once the page is blank, what makes the page more omed, more set aside for writing the same letters again in roughly the same size and in the same font as if I didn't have it? So to summarize, the run makes a diuk, and we bow to the diuk of the run, that gedola means is deliberate in the Gemara. It means not a regular letter, and it's not sufficient to explain the diuk to say as opposed to treated both into yozin. He derives from that 3 halachas. It has to be the same font, the same letter that I'm planning to write, and roughly the same size of letter. That's the chiddush of the run. I hear the run is saying that the determinants of Mochik, the run is bothered by a question. The lomdus behind the run is he's bothered by a question. What makes my erasing linked to a new kasav? Which new kasav? The answer is it has to be inherently linked to that, objectively preparing the groundwork for that kasav, and therefore he says it has to be the same type of kasav that I'm planning to put in its place. And there's 2 things I don't understand that. So one is who says it has to be objective, maybe subjective is enough, my intention. And number 2, even if you go by objective, I don't understand why that means it has to be the same sort of font and the same sort of size letter and the same type, the same actual letter as the one that you erased. So I'm afraid at this point I surrender. I genuinely spent a lot of time thinking about this run and reflecting and trying to understand it. I don't understand the lomdus of the run, what he's saying. Even if you argue that he would agree that when it's almanas, when you have intention, it would be sufficient without that. And he's talking here about default when it's stum, when you have no particular intention. He doesn't say that. And again, I still don't really understand it. So I surrender on this run.
Can I just ask about the size, the third diuk?
Just ask me live and then I'll come to you in a minute, Josh.
Yeah, sorry.
No, there's no problem. You can't hear. Not your fault. Yeah.
On the Mishnah, you have to remove a letter like another because they're made of this. And you put in place a similar size letter.
But not the identical letter. On the contrary, in the Mishkan, you removed an aleph to put in place a base or a gimel. And the run says that to be the same letter.
Yeah, but it's still removing a letter.
Yeah, so maybe those 2 conditions you can explain, but we have the 3rd condition in the run, so I don't understand it. Josh. By the way, the halacha, if it's not in this rare scenario of an ois gadol and ois katana, even the run would agree it doesn't have to be the same size font. If you're mochik 2 oises, the run would agree that it can be mochik 2 ashuris in order to write 2 mishak fonts, and that would be enough. So Josh, sorry.
I'm just a bit bothered by this same order of magnitude of size diuk, in the sense that the Gemara explicitly says that, you know, you remove a big one in order to write 2 small ones. Yeah. And then he seems, I think what you've said is that he's bothered by, and it's a good question that, well, hang on, I can always write 2 yuds, right? So,
yeah.
So, but then you end up in this, debate on it is almost meaningless now because it's between those two extremes, and those two extremes are undefined.
Yeah, I agree with you also. I don't understand the answer to that either. The Ram says it can't be that it's literally identical, because if it's literally identical, there's no way that you delete one letter and you have space for two letters. But it means main, Cain, roughly the same order of magnitude, therefore Benonius, but not small. Because small you could always fit in. Again, I have no idea what that means. But what makes this the same order of magnitude, right? Why should that matter? I genuinely, I don't know. Yes. Yes. I'm touching, I'm not attacking you, I'm just asking. Yeah. Yes.
He just seems to have a logically, there's a statistic on that one that picked up the bottom of in the whole melachot. Like, why if you write a picture, it's only one picture, if you write that. It's not difficult to borrow.
So for those online, Elio is saying, look, the Ram just is Madaik from the Gemara, and the Ram is telling us what he reads the Gemara saying, and the Ram doesn't suggest a Svara, and he's no more to blame for this than the Gemara is. He's just reading the Gemara. There's 2 points to make on this. The first is, even if you're right, I don't really care, meaning whether it's Gemara and his reading of the Gemara, or whether it's the Ram, the fact is we would like to understand what this is telling us. The second point is, and this comes down to Darkei Halimud, but certainly the Derech Halimud that's been adopted in the Olam Yeshivas is that it's not enough to point out a difference. We always need to draw a distinction. So if you ask me a contradiction between two halachas, and I say this is talking about red lorry, yellow lorry. This is talking about a red lorry, and that's one talking about a yellow lorry. That's not a meaningful distinction unless you can explain why red and yellow are pertinent distinctions. You can always draw thousands of distinctions, but any creative mind can look at any two scenarios and list an infinite number of differences. None of this is relevant unless the differences are distinctions, unless they are pertinent to drawing a distinction. The Ram could have said, for that matter, just like a P makes a P sound, and therefore Samach makes a Samach sound that would be different. But the Ram, when he gives these three distinctions, surely understood there's something pertinent and relevant about these distinctions. And at least in the sort of Yeshiva Lithuanian Derech Halimud, we assume that every distinction should be, every difference drawn should be a distinction, and therefore there should be some conceptual reason. That doesn't mean to say that it is a distinction that we would have intuited without the Gemara. But now the Gemara has told us this, or now the Rishon told us this, we can hear why they saw that as relevant. It doesn't mean we would have thought of it ourselves, otherwise we would never need to learn. But now that they've drawn the distinction, you can see why, in their thinking at least, this is a pertinent distinction. So, for the purpose of this discussion anyway, I don't care if it's the Gemara or the Ram. The fact is, we have a source in Torah that says this is different, and I've got no idea why, and that's upsetting. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop there for today. We've run out of time, and in Hashem next week, Sunday, not Tuesday, we will carry on.